Hi, and welcome to VIBEZ Daily. This is a daily devotional curated by VIBEZ Church to help you practice the way of Jesus and be all that God has called you to be. You have joined us for our year-long series titled Devoted. Acts 2:42 tells us that the followers of Jesus were devoted to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking of bread, and to prayer. This podcast was created to provide context and commentary for what you read each day. Just before our friends begin discussing today's reading, we want to invite you not only for fellowship, but for prayer as well. We have created the VIBE Daily Chat Group to offer you fellowship and a community where you can state your observations, ask questions about the reading or the podcast. You can join us by downloading the VIBEZ Church app in your favorite app store. Click Join the Conversation and join us today. And finally, we hope that you can join us for prayer. Prayer happens Monday through Friday, and more information on that can be found on the VIBEZ Church app under prayer. Now, let's begin our conversation on today's reading.
All right, welcome back to the VIBEZ Daily podcast. This is day 38 of our Devoted series. We are now halfway through Leviticus. Today we are reading Leviticus 12 through 16, but we'll discuss 11 through 16 here in a moment. And by we, I mean my wife, Victoria, and my friend Shameeka, who are here with us as we continue this journey through scripture. And so, yeah, let's just hop right in, have a few chapters to cover today. Again, starting at chapter 11, which we read yesterday, but really kind of goes well together with the next couple chapters, which is kind of why we wanted to cover it at the same time. But we get these instructions. The Lord is speaking to Moses and Aaron again with instructions for the Israelites, really clarifying, I think you guys brought up yesterday, this word or this vocabulary term now that they've added of clean and unclean, right? Yeah. And what that means. And so now just kind of really taking time to clarify some of what that looks like here in chapter 11. What jumped out to you guys as God starts to delineate and distinguish between what's clean and what's unclean?
Again, just how detailed he was. He's like, let me give you guys the list of these things. And part of me had wondered if, when it came to the food and God establishing what was clean and unclean, if it was a charge for the people to not be glutton, because it's easy for us to food be everything to us, and to especially want what's good and what tastes good and stuff. But I feel like this is introducing a level of discipline to them, even with food, that they're having to learn as a result.
That's good. Sure. That's good. Yeah, there's a passage. Can't pull words from right now. I'll come back to you on that. But where I want to say Paul is the author of it, though, but who just reminds us that, maybe everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial, right? And it's just that idea that, you technically maybe could eat it, right? And you wouldn't die from it, but it doesn't mean it's good for you, right? Yeah. And so I do think it's teaching a level of discipline of, just denying of yourself of certain things for the sake of ultimately, like you said, just some of that discipline there.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that you said that, because at the beginning in Genesis, right, he was just like, I give you the plants and the vegetables, this first of all, that's what you got as food. Yeah. And then come Noah, chapter 9, he's like, I give you anything, right? I give you everything, the green plants and everything that lives, every moving thing that lives shall be your food. But also he makes sure he tells them but don't eat the blood,
right.
Yeah.
But now here's a shift again where he's like, okay, no, not everything, okay, guys. Okay, and I wonder if it's to your point that they got ahead of themselves, where he's like, okay, you're not gonna do what all these other people are doing and whatever they're eating and all those things. This is to show and prove that you are separate and you are holy in your mind, and because I said so, right? Because I said so here. And so I think it's interesting that he said from that chapter 9 in Genesis, he has now just been like, okay, no, these are what will keep you clean, make you clean. and these are unclean. But I mean, can they just say that this whole animal that chews the cud is just disgusting to me?
Yes.
Like this whole like eat the animals that regurgitates their food and chews it for a second time. Like that's disgusting.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody else feels that way, but I just be like, why you gotta be that? Like, can we have some other distinction of what's clean?
But I think it's actually, I'm glad you said that, because to me, this whole section, even in Leviticus, as we get into some of the other like laws dealing with cleanliness and uncleanliness, and even like, skin disease and some other stuff, it's interesting because to me, when I actually read this section, including the food, it almost feels like God is trying to establish what a healthy lifestyle is for his people, right? So not even just like clean or unclean. You can also consider like healthy and unhealthy, like because he's almost establishing even best medical practices for his people.
Yeah.
And I wonder if some of that is because, yes, that's obviously that food is digested well, right? You might want to say what you want to about how disgusting it is, but that food is digested well, right? These aren't animals that are just like eating stuff whole and just swallowing it, and that's the kind of meat intake you're taking, but that you're taking stuff, animals that are, and even a lot of these are also herbivores, right? That are they're grazing, and they're like really taking the time to digest that food, and so. Like, I look at it and go, yeah, this almost is a who's who of like some of the best foods for you to eat. Like if you're going to eat, right? If you're going to eat meat, that these are like, okay, these are some of the ones that are healthiest for you compared to, obviously pork and some of the other stuff that's on here of what's unclean. And so I think it does kind of establish almost for his holy people, not just a set apart lifestyle, but a lifestyle that's actually good for them, right? Like, God has been clear from the beginning, like what he establishes for us is good for us, right? And so whether it's our diet, whether it's our skincare and things like, quarantine and whatnot that comes out of this, whether it's how we handle childbirth, whatever, like these are like good things for our health and our lifestyle that I feel like God is also just trying to help his people understand, right? So, I think, like I said, it might sound disgusting, but I'm like, that's probably also actually best for you. Yeah.
I'm glad you said it, because that was my takeaway from the other chapters of just seeing, like, God really giving them divine strategy on, like, the do's and don'ts, and even some of the things that we will get to with the whole, like, quarantining and stuff. Like, we do that today. If somebody's sick in the house, you try to stay away, or even with COVID, when just quarantining and staying away. So I thought it was really cool, because I feel like it's God establishing himself even more as not just their provider, but also their healer, their doctor, like the one that ultimately, like, he's the resource for all these ways of living and ways of staying clean and ways of staying sanctified. Like, I thought that was beautiful, because it's like, where else would you want to get that from? Like, you're getting it straight from the source, and him teaching the priest as to be the ones to be able to kind of like determine and like, let me show you what it's supposed to look like and what it's not. Like, I think it really is cool, because they're like our first doctors.
No, I love that you said that, because that's one of the things that I definitely highlighted when it got to like the priests and them being the ones to look at all the things and to make the determining factor. It was just like, oh, these weren't doctors who were doing this, because all of it, once again, for Leviticus purpose, like all of this was to say who could be in God's presence or not. It wasn't even just being healed or being, disease free for the sake of. Right? Like, it was being disease free. It was staying away from these things so that you can be in God's presence. Like, because when you weren't clean, you weren't able to go to the tabernacle. You weren't able to go to the temple. Like, you had to be clean in order to enter God's presence. And so I think it was really interesting that, like, it is like this whole, this is how I want you to live. It's going to cost you something. Right? Like, it's going to take sacrifices for you to dwell with me. Even, and like I said, I mentioned it yesterday, like, even today, like, it kind of saddens me that we kind of live in this like, well, Jesus came and paid it all so we can live how we want to live in this world of grace,
right?
Which is totally different from God's heart, right? Because sin still separates us from God.
Yeah.
And so it still is going to cost us something to be in communion with God and to live this life of following Jesus and following God. And so that's what I see here, even in just like the eat this but don't eat that. Like, you can have this because it's like, no, the world's not yours right now. Like, this is what I have for you.
Yeah.
I love you said, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, and I won't, we don't have to skip everything, but there was a verse that just jumped out to me in Leviticus 16, where it's verse 31, where it says it is a Sabbath. Again, we'll get to the context of what happens here at 16, but just to add to your point, it says, this is a CSB, it is a Sabbath of complete rest for you, and you must practice self-denial. Like, and to your point that, like, it was this, it jumped out to me when I read that it was just like, this is not all about you. Like, it's actually about denial of yourself and denying yourself, which is something Jesus even teaches later, right? When he tells us to take up our cross and to follow him. But, to your point, there is this clear teaching and practice and theme of like denying oneself for the sake of being in God's presence and his holiness and his righteousness in that regard. So
and I was gonna say, I do see a lot of this being for their protection as well. Like, again, if we're talking about the skin diseases and like God knowing like this is something that could spread through the community and that can like wipe out people, like he's ultimately trying to protect them. And I was reminded of like all of this, honestly, like the whole skin diseases and all that stuff, this wouldn't have even been chapters that we've read about had in Exodus they had not built that calf.
Yeah.
Because literally God had promised them like no sicknesses, no diseases. Like that was one of the promises that I was like, my ears perked up because I'm like, what you mean? Like, I can live a life without sickness or illness, but as a result of their sin and disobeying him, in the first commandment, like, now you are going to have these things, these skin diseases, these sores, these different things that's going to cause you to be unclean, set apart, that could spread, that could kill. But yet he's still a gracious God enough to be like, well, this, as a result, this is what you can do with it.
Doesn't it just remind you of the garden, right? Like, we were never built to live in a world like this. With sin and death and sickness and all this stuff and separation from God. But once sin hit the scene, like you said, things change, and now these things are the results and consequences that we have to deal with. We see it again here.
Good. So we get kind of clean and unclean when it comes to diet. We also get it for what not to touch, right? Don't get salmonella. Touching these dead animals. We get, chapter 12, we kind of get to childbirth specifically. To you guys' points, and actually, I'll pause here for a second because one of the things that does blow my mind about this is one of the things in all of these books since we've been through them that just blows my mind is just, again, how much wisdom is in it for it to have been so long ago. Right. And like, to your point, right, these are things that we still practice today and understand to be true and holy, and not even just holy, but true and healthy and good for us. That, like, we've had the instructions from day one or from the longest. And I just love that wisdom, right? Moses is not a doctor. You know what I'm saying? Like, he doesn't have a history in healthcare and whatnot. That wasn't his background, but through the wisdom of God and through God's word, he gives clear instructions to the people of how to live a somewhat healthy life. So we get that for childbirth and skin disease kind of in 12 and 13. Anything that just jumped out to you guys as we look at those next couple chapters of 12, 13, and 14 that you guys thought was interesting? What do you think on that? Something I just want to call out at this point. Our priests are butchers, grill masters, and doctors at this point. Is all of their roles. So these priests are very, very talented individuals, or at least have a lot of responsibility, it seems. But.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm still stuck in chapter 11.
What you got?
This is verse 44. I'm moving on, though. This, once again, to consecrate yourself, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. I just think this is just, it's profound. But moving on. It's just so profound. I'm so sorry, y'all.
He's going to continue to say it, too.
He is.
Like, you'll see it. Him have to repeat himself.
But yeah, but then, like you said, you go on, and it's just like this purifying for this woman after childbirth for like 66 days. And like most doctors are going to tell you that like you need to like be gentle on yourself, abstain for certain things, like for about 6 to 8 weeks, right? And like you said, like that's still something that we are practicing today, that like this 6 to 8 weeks after delivery, and like, and it shows up here. I think it's just like you saying, I'm just reiterating that. That is just amazing. But I think for me what also stuck out though, and going into chapter these next chapters, is this 7 days, right? Like this number 7 that just keeps coming up, like this number of completion. And so I think it was really interesting to me that they'll be unclean when the woman conceives, like she'll be unclean for 7 days, right? Or that like the priest continuously shut things and quarantine them for 7-day periods. Like that, like after these 7 days, something should have happened if it was going to resolve. And if it doesn't, okay, this thing it's more of a big deal than we thought, right?
Yeah. Even for the birth of their son too, like 7 days he's considered like unclean, but then on the 8th day, that's when the circumcision and stuff happens. So it's cool to really see like God is still establishing them to continue on that generational request of like making sure that the boys are circumcised, consecrating them to the Lord, kind of thing. You get to see that in there. And even again, I always appreciate whenever I just see God really caring for those who may not have as much as others. So again, we're still talking about the whole childbirth thing, but whenever he says in verse 8 of chapter 12, like, but if she cannot afford a lamb, like she is to bring 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, one for a burnt offering, the other for a sin offering, so that the priest can make an atonement for her and she'll be clean. So I think that's cool because we're seeing the offering still, like he's still talking about the burnt offerings. You got the sin offering, but he's making it a way to where like, hey, you may not be able to afford a lamb, but I'm still giving you opportunities and ways to bring something to me that you'll be able to give.
And I saw that for the lepers too. In chapter 14, verse 21, but it was telling if the leper is poor and can't afford, what he needs to make himself clean, then like this is what he can bring. But this whole, like both of these chapters, can I just say shout out to The Chosen? Shout out to The Chosen. We love, right? We binge watch it. We love this series because it depicts like this leper who is coming up to them, and it really like made me think about that like episode when I was reading through it, because like his clothes were torn, like he was trying to barter for like money and stuff, but like even him going to the shop to get money for what the last things that he had was an abomination because he was too close, right? Like, and it just really showed to me like how poor they might have been. Like they can't work, like they have to live out of the city, they're not around any family, like so it's pretty much like if you get clean, you have to go probably find some family members who's willing to give you these things to go present yourself to the priest, because like you're supposed to be covering your mouth, saying unclean, unclean. People are supposed to stay away from you. And just imagine like these people were unclean for years, right? In years, like how do you eat? And where do you live if you are ostracized? And so to me, even just looking at like, I don't know, I was just thinking like if I was a leper and they had to bring the priest to come look, like them 7 days, like I'm just like, I really hope this isn't leprosy. Like you're looking at the scabs like every minute, like just wondering, like, is this really going to be my life? Are they really going to send me out of the city to be poor, right? And hungry.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's good. It's good, yeah. But so yeah, we see these again, like these medical kind of commands, I should say. And like I said, there's a childbirth. The skin disease takes up a couple chapters, right? Kind of specifically on that.
Got mold.
Even the fabrics that like touch that stuff, right? Kind of what to do with that as well. Or like you said, the mold and mildew there. So anything else you guys thought was interesting about these laws, specifically with cleanliness and uncleanliness, as God is establishing the difference between those?
I think it was super interesting in chapter 14 in verse 34. And it says, when you come into the land of Canaan, which I give you for possession, and I put a case of leprous disease in a house in the land of your possession. I think it was really interesting that wording of like, if I put like, and just to even think about this, like God probably is allowing or afflicting, people with these things, and like all this is under his controlling realm, right? And so I think it's really interesting that it's like, okay, like I put this case of disease in this house, right? I think it showed me that. But even I was even thinking like, oh, it kind of makes sense, because even in the New Testament, when Jesus steps on the scene, sometimes when he heals people, he's like, and sin no more. And so even though it might not be like, like it might be a result of their sin, or even this result maybe of their family sin or something like that. Like, so I think it was really interesting that like the consequences, like you said, of sin of just.
Yeah. And that's often what was believed, right? Like it was often believed. I mean, it's why I can't recall exactly the specific story, but there, I think it was he was like blind and mute. I think was the specific story where Jesus encountered someone, and everybody assumed that his like ailments were the result of sin within his family, because like that was the common practice or common belief of what was taking place. And so to your point, it's even why this leprosy thing kind of seemed unfair. Like, man, I got a skin disease, but like now I'm getting kicked out of my city. But the belief or assumption is that skin disease is a result of sin, right? Or that's how it became a part of you. And so, yes, you are unclean, not just physically due to your ailments, but because of the sin that probably brought about whatever happened, which again, is something we do see God use often. Was he would afflict people with leprosy, he afflict them with skin disease when they were sinful. Yeah,
and we will see him talk about in a few chapters, like even plagues that will come on as a consequence of like disobedience and stuff. But even like since we have read Exodus already, we saw what he did to the Egyptians, like to get their attention or to try to soften hearts or whatever. He's like, okay, now I'm gonna put a plague on you, kind of thing. But that is very interesting to point out how, again, because even after the generations, people still know the stories of what happened and the things that took place, why they would associate that with sin.
And I think it's super interesting too that like after this leper is to come offer his sacrifice, the sin offering, the guilt offering that he has to give, that there's like this consecration that happens of the leper afterwards, like in chapter 14, somewhere around like verse 14 through 20. Like it's once again like the priest is now taking the blood and putting it on the right ear lobe of his, and on the thumb and the big toe and stuff like that. Again, it's kind of like this reconsecration of this person back to the Lord, like as his. And so we don't see that with the other offerings, earlier that we saw. Like if you, did this to this person or did that to that person or false testimony. We don't see that. But like here, it's like it does seem like they were like so removed from God's presence that like even getting back to being with God, like it had to be this whole like process again.
But I also saw like God's love even for them in that, because again, you do naturally think about the shunning away, but yet like God still wanted to make reparations and make sure they were able to be back in community, not just with him but with their people. So I do love that, because he could have been like, y'all go off to a distant land, never come back, like all those things. But yeah,
good. Okay. Well, into chapter 15, we still kind of continue this unclean and clean kind of theme here. My Bible titles are just bodily discharges.
Yes.
It's kind of the subject of chapter 15 specifically. Anything that you guys thought was interesting about this before we kind of get into this last chapter, chapter 16 of our reading today?
Like the Lord was covering a whole lot. Like he was covering thing after thing, like discharge from like a disease, discharge because y'all was and
Being fruitful and multiplying.
being fruitful and doing things. And then, but what stuck out to me was in chapter 15 verse 25, like this woman who had like a discharge of blood, or like just once again like knowing that like she would continue to be unclean until it stopped, which of course reminded me of the woman of the issue of blood in Luke chapter 8 verses 43, who was unclean for 12 years.
Yeah.
And like just even looking at here, like what that meant, that like whoever touched her, whoever touched anything that she touched or sat on, or like anything of hers, her bed, like she was really ostracized as well, just like a leper, right? Like she was really cut off from people. And so the fact that she bombarded her way through this crowd, like I don't care who I'm touching, who I'm making unclean right now, like, I am getting to Jesus. Like it just really did show the boldness, because like people would have really lashed out on her, like if they knew before he healed her, right? Like that she was in the midst of that crowd. But yeah, it was just very interesting that, like you said, you couldn't even be near anyone without making them unclean as well for a period of time.
Yeah.
I think thank you for bringing that story up as another one. I think of like the Good Samaritan, which is another example of someone who's covered in blood. They've been beaten and whatnot, and the priest and the Levi kind of pass on the other side of the road to avoid touching him, because he would be unclean and they would be unclean. They're headed to Jerusalem, so definitely probably headed to go worship in the temple. You can't have touched blood and go do that. And like one of the things that's always stuck out to me about those passages, and I think we see this happen, is it feels as if the people of God misunderstood like the purpose of these laws, and that these were never meant to be issues between us. But it was between us and God, right? Like when he says you're unclean, it's like, okay, you are not worthy to be in my presence. It was never meant to be you're not worthy to be in each other's presence, because again, y'all are all unclean. Let's just call it what it is. You guys are all sinful. You're all unclean. But it was meant to be about God and us. I mean, God and I, like our relationship, and not about one another. And the reason I say that too is because I think it's clear, like you see it in Jesus's ministry. Jesus approaches all of these unclean people. Now he does it to heal them, but he touches them before they're healed, right? So he touches them while they're unclean to make them clean. And I think like, one of the big ideas I've often taken from like passages like the woman that issued of blood and the Good Samaritan, these that are in the New Testament, is I think God, when he established the law, he never established a law for us to mistreat one another. If the law causes us to not love one another, or causes us to ostracize each other, or causes us to mistreat one another, then we've missed the point of the law. Right? Like we've just missed it, because if we read the law as a whole, even back to the 10 Commandments, we know God wants us to love each other. He wants us to care for one another. And I think we've missed the point. If we ever come away from, in our excuse for not doing the right thing for somebody, our excuse for not helping them, our excuse for not loving them is something to the effect of they're unclean. oh, we've missed it. Like we've missed the mark of what God intended. And so I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think I can easily see how you can read these laws and come away from it like, oh, I can't be by a leper, and I can't be by someone who's bleeding, and I can't be by this, like, and get to the point of like, I'm thinking like, I'm too holy to be in your presence.
Yeah.
Right?
That's good.
Based off of what you're dealing with, I can understand how someone can come away from that, reading that. And I love that when Jesus comes on the scene, he's like, y'all missed it. You missed the point.
Yeah.
That wasn't the point. The point wasn't so that you guys would think you were too holy for one another, because you're not. It was so that you could understand what it took to be in the presence of a holy God, not in one another. And so, yeah, again, if the law is causing you to not love somebody or to not do the right thing for someone else, you've missed it. You've missed the point. And I think that in our time today, like, we can't. The Bible should never be an excuse for me not to love somebody.
Yeah.
Like, the Bible should never be an excuse for me not to do the right thing or not to be good to someone. I've missed it. If I come away from all this and go, oh, now I know these are the kind of people I should avoid, then I've missed it.
Exactly.
I've missed it.
Which I think is the difference between, like you said, it says this in verse 31 of chapter 15, that like, you need to keep these people separate from their uncleanness, because lest they die in the presence of the Lord in the tabernacle.
Yes.
Like like you can't be unclean and come into the Lord's presence, right?
Yes.
I think there's also a difference though between like these people with these certain discharges and a leper, though, because I feel like leprosy was highly contagious though. And so like, although we should not shun them and, you know, leave them out to fend for themselves, I think there was a separation though of like, they have to live outside the city, just so that like all the people don't become lepers, right? That like, in that all of God's people like won't be able to come in his presence. But like you said, you could very well go and take food out to the outside of the city, right?
Yep.
You could very well go and take blankets. You could go and build structures for them to live in, shelters for them to live in, and still keep your distance. But like you said, have efforts of love. That show that like, we still care about you. Like you are still a person. Like God still is looking upon you.
And we'll see even in the later chapters like how, you know, that would be such a God thing, because even when it comes to like God talking about when the land should rest and all that stuff, like he's establishing stuff so that even the least of these, like the foreigners, like the poor, like they have what they need.
That's really good. I thought about that too.
All right, let's wrap up chapter 16. Anything here? This establishes what becomes known as like the Day of Atonement, essentially. So it is a, you know, God has established a few different like days to observe throughout the year, whether it's Passover, some other things. What do you guys think was interesting, or anything that stuck out to you guys in chapter 16?
The beginning, like it pointing out as a result of like Aaron's sons dying, how, you know, the Lord wanted Moses to tell Aaron that he is not to come whenever he chooses into the most holy place behind the curtain in front of the atonement cover of the ark, or else he would die. So like God already set in the tone, like you don't get to do what you want. Like you can only come to the most holy place in certain circumstances. And I was like, okay, we making it clear and known.
It's good.
I think I like the order of how it was. Like, all right, so Aaron's supposed to like enter this place. He makes atonement for himself and his household. He makes atonement for the people of Israel. And then for the actual holy place itself, right? The house, the holy place, the tent of meeting, and the altar. And I do love that. Like, there's so much like order, and structure to these like rules and laws. But then also that I realized here, like even just for him to figure out like what goat to use, that he had to like cast a lot. Like it wasn't that like the Lord's voice was going to speak and say, use this for, like, it once again was this delineation between how God spoke to Moses and how God's going to plan to speak to the priests and Aaron and the rest of those generations that, like, okay, you're going to have to cast lots and see, you know, where you're going to take this, like, which one you're going to kill and which one's going to go to this uninhabitable place, which I think was interesting, too, that was kind of like, trying to read the commentary on what this uninhabitable place was and the meaning of what this goat was that had to leave. And like one was saying it could be carrying away like evil, you know, for the people. One could be like the what is it? Don't they have a goat that like gets like sent away on its own?
This is where the term scapegoat.
The scapegoat, exactly, the scapegoat. So that was interesting though, but that it wasn't a for certain there. Like there's so many for certain laws, but this instance is like, okay, now cast a lot and see what the Lord determines.
Yeah. Which requires dependence on God. Like He's going to be the one to tell you and answer it. Yeah. I was going to say I do love, like you were pointing out, just the different layers as far as like, you know, having to make atonement for his household and the community and stuff. I do love, because we do get to see that in other parts of scripture, how important it is for us to be intercessors for like our families and stuff, and how God does honor going to him and repenting on behalf of the sin and wickedness of people. And we've gotten to see even up to this point, like God actually showing grace and mercy as a result of one person coming to intercede for a people or for a person or a relative, and how he grants grace. So
yeah, that's good. Yeah, I mean, I think what I just appreciated is, you know, going back to one of the conversations we had, I think maybe it was the first day this week that we talked, but that, like, you know, God makes us delineation between kind of the commitment of sin and then the recognition of that sin, like actually becoming aware. I just love that he just kind of establishes this catch-all day that like it's just kind of like, look, at the end of the day, y'all not going to still recognize that you're still sinful. There's going to be some things you miss and you're just not kind of going to know. Yeah. So like, let me just establish this day that like the whole point of it is to just reset and let's get back to clean and holy, like, and let's just atone for it. And I think, like I said, it's very reminiscent. You know, you can read some of this, a lot of, not reminiscent, that's not the worst word, but you can read a lot of this and start to see how Jesus ultimately kind of steps in a similar way, that he just kind of just pays that sacrifice and covers the sins of, you know, whether those committed, those to be committed, those understood and those not understood. Like it was just this permanent sacrifice and atonement that was made. But like I read this and I just love that it's just kind of like, yeah, man, end of the day, like you said, for your family, then ultimately for the people. But it feels like this day was established just for the point of, if we got through this whole year and you haven't actually confessed certain sin, let's just cover those too. Let's just make sure we get those as well.
Again, given so many opportunities to get it right. That's good.
And I think it's also to like add on that, like he gave him opportunities to like, all right, everybody get it right, but also that he made it a Sabbath. Like that everybody rests too. Like I don't know if all y'all Sabbathing, but this is also a day of rest. It's for you.
Complete rest.
Complete rest.
I don't know if you saw that, but in verse 31 it says complete rest for me.
Yeah.
It's good. Anything else kind of in these chapters?
I think that's all for me.
All right. Well, appreciate you guys joining us here today. We will pick up at chapter 17 tomorrow. We'll continue through Leviticus. See you then.
Thank you for joining us for the VIBEZ Daily podcast. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, or download our favorite, the VIBEZ Church app. Visit vibes.church/devoted for additional episodes, notes, details, and the latest merch. Join us next time as we continue our journey through the Bible.